Great. Yeah.
All right, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here on this windy afternoon. My name is Cinnamon Moffat, and I'll be your host for this event. For those folks that maybe haven't been to one of these before, this is a hybrid event. So we have folks online and folks in the room. Welcome to you both. For folks online, if you go ahead and put any technical questions you might have or any questions for our speaker into the chat box, we have our volunteer, Roseanne, in the room who's going to help us with all of those kind of questions and make sure that our speaker gets those. So feel free to interact with us that way. For folks that are in the room, if you have a question when we get to the question and answer section, just raise your hand and I will bring you this mic. And that way folks online can hear as well. And that way everybody gets to participate in these hybrid events. But again, thank you so much for being here. I've got a couple of quick announcements. Next week's seminar has had to be canceled. We had an EPA speaker who was unable to join us next week. So this is our last seminar of the academic year. Yay, we're going to end with Sally. We will pick up seminar again for our summer series on the 26th with student speakers. So come on back and join us at that time. I also wanted to just promote our Markham Symposium. So our Markham Symposium, let's see if I have details, is June 18th. The Markham Symposium is a time when we celebrate our students who are award winners and get additional scholarship funds. So come and support our student researchers. The event will be in this room on that Wednesday, starting at 2 with a keynote speaker. We'll have a poster session starting at 3, and then we'll have a night talk starting at 4. So it should be a really great day. Hope you all can come and join us there. If you ever want to know about any of our events, you can go to the HMSC homepage, go to the event page and scroll down. You'll find out all the information you need on how to come in the room or join us online. So thank you for that. But I want to quickly hand this off to today's speaker. So we are so honored to have Sally Hacker join us for the seminar series. Sally has been a faculty member at OSU since 2004. Her research explores the structure, function, service of natural and managed I got to read and slow down, managed coastal ecosystems under varied context and species interaction and global change. In addition to her research, Sally teaches multiple courses from introduction to ecology, community ecology, field ecology, and marine biology, including our very own Bio 450 here at Hatfield, which is just getting ready to wrap up. She is an author and a co-author of numerous articles, book chapters, and 2 textbooks. And her background is she has a bachelor's in zoology from the University of Washington. She has a master's in Department of Zoology at the University of Maine. Go Black Bears, that's my alma mater as well. And a PhD from the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Brown. I believe she's here today to talk a little bit about her beachgrass work. And so I'm just going to quickly hand it off to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Are you green? Did you turn it on?
Yep, I did. Can people hear me? All right, good. So yeah, the title of my talk is A Century of Beachgrass Invasions and the Landscape Level Consequences for the U.S. Pacific Northwest Coast. So I'm going to talk about these environments that actually experience a lot of wind, and particularly today. Let's see. I'm going to try to advance. There we go. So this work that I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of the culmination of a lot of people, a lot of amazing grad students, some of which have given talks on some of the topics that I'm going to talk about today. But also my collaborators, they include Peter Ruggiero, who is a professor in CEOS on the OSU campus, and Dr. Megan Wengrove, who is also a professor in civil engineering. So she's a coastal engineer, and she is married to Drummond, who I'm sure many of you know here. Oh, there we go. So need to go back. Pacific Northwest dunes are they make up nearly 50% of our coastline, the Pacific Northwest coastline. So we're really lucky to have these amazing habitats. We actually have the largest dune sheet in North America here in Oregon, it's called the Coos Bay Dune Sheet. down south. And this immense landscape actually inspired Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune, to write Dune. And so any of you who have read his book or seen the movies can kind of understand how this really large sandy habitat inspired him to write these kind of amazing books. So whenever I talk about dunes, I like to think about them in terms of their past, their present, and their future. And they're a good ecosystem to talk about the past because it's a very interesting story. So in the past, 100 years ago or so, these habitats were very open, shifting sand environments. So prior to 1900, they were really sparsely vegetated, and they featured this kind of really dynamic, open, shifting sand environment. And there was an incredibly interesting native dune community that included a diversity of species that thrived under these very sandy environments. Many of them are endemic to dunes and endemic to the Northwest. But there's actually really very little known about the natural history of native dunes because people didn't really study them prior to 1900. So we don't have a lot of information about them. There was a native dune grass called American dune grass, and it's still present today, actually fairly abundant on dunes. But it didn't really stabilize dunes in the way that the invasive beach grasses have. So European settlement was really hindered by this sand mobility. Sand was blowing back into communities, across roads, across railroads, et cetera. And that was, quite a problem. In fact, even in the 1870s, so this is an excerpt from the tri-weekly Asturian from Astoria in 1874. And this excerpt says, when Clatsop Plains were first settled, the sea ridges were covered with wild vegetation, which held the sands in check. But since that time, by excessive pasturage, the grasses have been destroyed and the sands loosened. The sands, driven by the winds, drifted back upon the plains and covered the meadows till it became necessary to take steps for united efforts towards checking these encroachments. To this end, the town of Clatsop Plains was incorporated, but the only plan adopted by the authorities has been to cause each farmer to keep the cattle off of the sea ridges in front of the farms so that the native vegetation may again spread over the sand. So this vegetation was stabilizing dunes to some extent, but because of grazing pressure, that destabilized the dunes and created this kind of coastal hazard. And that coastal hazard, even though they were taking their cattle off the sea ridge and so forth, it still existed. And so finally, they decided to plant invasive beach grasses to stabilize the dunes, the foredunes. And so in the early 1900s, non-native beach grasses were systematically planted across the Pacific coast. And they created these linear foredunes that we see today, that we have today. So whenever we go out to the beach, behind all those beaches are what we call foredunes, and these very large hills of sand that are being held in place by the beach grasses and their roots and rhizomes. And I love this picture of this guy up in the corner from the 1940s with beach grass in his backpack, and he's out, planting these beach grasses to kind of shore up the beach in front of his farm. So there were two species of grasses that were planted. One is the European beach grass, and that was planted in the early 1900s and actually widely planted all over the Pacific coast. Actually started The planting started in San Francisco and kind of moved up north and also south. So it was widely planted. By the 1950s, Ammophila arenaria, which is the European beachgrass, had really colonized all of the Pacific coast from Mexico to Canada. And then in the 1930s, 1935 in particular, American beachgrass, which is Ammophila breviligulata, and Ammophila breviligulata is from the east coast of the US and the Great Lakes, so it's not native to this region. It was also introduced into Northern Oregon, and in particular around the Columbia River, and it grew very, very well, especially to the north, and dominates Washington and Northern Oregon coast. So if you go up to Long Beach or anywhere north in Washington, the majority of the grass that you'll see is this American beach grass, Ammophila breviligulata. Whereas here in Newport and south of Newport, and actually south of Lincoln City, it's mostly Ammophila arenaria, the European beach grass. But Ammophila arenaria does co-occur with the American beach grass in the north. It's just not as abundant, and it has been slowly outcompeted over time. So what happened once the beach grasses were planted? Well, they really took to this environment, to this climate. And there are records. Here's some historical photos from a book by William Cooper, and you can see the beach grasses are starting to colonize these very open areas and starting to take hold. And here are some aerial photos. There's one here of Pacific City, where you can see that in the 1930s, there's a lot of white, which is all sand. And then by 2012, a lot of that sand has been colonized by grasses. You can see, a lot of green in that picture down below, and also a lot of houses. And so one of the things that happened is once the dunes were stabilized, they were just ripe for development. And so a lot of these areas were developed because of the beach grass situation. You can see on the other side, this is Umpqua Dunes. In 1953, you can see kind of a little bit of a foredune running along what looks like the waves in that picture. And then down below, this is today, this is aerial photo today. You can see the foredune, I've marked it there. And then behind that foredune is a massive amount of swampy, terrestrialized treed habitat, forested habitat. So really large scale transformation of these habitats. And so what are the consequences of this transformation? Well, obviously, these vegetative foredunes are capturing and stabilizing sand. They're serving as barriers for extreme storms, sea level rise, and tsunamis. And they're also preventing erosion compared to, let's say, hard structures that you might install. And this really creates, by having dunes instead of hard structures, you really create a kind of healthy beach environment for recreation. But of course, there are many trade-offs. And one of the trade-offs is that this has allowed development in these historically kind of hazardous coastal areas. There have been declines of native species, including the western snowy plover, which is ESA listed. And there's been an increase in other invaders invading these habitats, including Scotch broom and gorse. And it's really interfered with coastal view sheds and some of the cultural values that people appreciate about a native dune system. So that's the past. What I want to do now is talk about the present. So now we're in the age really of beach grasses and dune transformation. And what does that mean in terms of our kind of understanding how these systems work? And so what I've done is spend a lot of time trying to understand what are the factors that influence the building of dunes and what determines their shape. And we want to know this for all the reasons that I talked about earlier, coastal protection, but also, the habitat value for native species. And so this is actually a paper that just got published 2 weeks ago called Ecomorphodynamics of Coastal Foredune Evolution. So that's just a fancy way of saying, how do the grasses or the vegetation interact with sand to produce these really important structures on our coast and these really important ecosystems. And so as you're guessing, the really important factor is sand and the vegetation and how they interact and create these habitats. And so what we've done is look at this question from a number of different scales, from the scale of a region, so the regional drivers of dune shape, because we know that our dunes along the Oregon and Washington coast vary dramatically in their shape, in their height, in their width, et cetera. So we can use that variability to try to understand what are the factors important there. We've also looked at local drivers of dune shape. So how does the sand and vegetation feedback actually work, kind of at a mechanistic or process scale? And so we've looked at it from the scale of a foredune, so an entire foredune. You can see a picture there of an experiment that we've set up in a very flattened foredune area to look at how dunes are created. From the whole plant scale, so you can see a picture there of dune bags that are actually here at Hatfield, and in the background is Gwynn Library. To the stem scale, so using wind tunnels to send sand at vegetation and look at the physics behind how sand is captured by these plants. And then using all those data to, in numerical models, to try to evolve dunes over time and understand the factors that are important in dune shape. And so at the regional scale, this kind of regional control scale, we've used shoreline data, so data about really how much sand is coming into the shoreline to those beaches, and vegetation data to try to predict how important is sand versus vegetation in determining dune shape. And what we found is that actually sand explains about 50% of the variability that we see along the coast in dune shape. So it's a big driver of dune shape. Without sand, we wouldn't have dunes, obviously. And the beachgrasses, their density explains about 10% of that variation. So less variation, but still a significant factor. It's the second most predictor of dune shape. And then another kind of regional control issue that we've considered is across this region, our surveys show that the European beachgrass, remember the one that's kind of in the south, is associated with taller dunes than the American beachgrass, which is associated with shorter, narrower dunes. And so why is that? What's controlling that association? It's a very strong association. You can see that actually here, dune height is almost twice, dunes are almost twice as tall when they're covered with the European beachgrass, than the American beachgrass. And they're twice as narrow as well. So they're very tall and narrow compared to the American beachgrass. So could these grasses be controlling dune height? And that's been something that we've focused on quite a bit. So, what we've asked is, how do differences in grass species morphology actually affect dune shape? because we know there's wide variability in grass species morphology, even though most people think grasses all look the same. I'm here to tell you that they aren't all built the same. They actually have different kind of growth forms and different morphologies that affect how much sand is being captured and affect the feedback between sand and the vegetation growth. So these species-specific effects of dune shape, we've studied them again. I mentioned this at the foredune scale, at the whole plant scale, and also at the stem scale, to try to look at, what is it about these species that makes them better sand captures or not. And we've used those data in these numerical models. This is a numerical model. It says mode, but it should be model, called Aeolus. And Aeolus is this model that that considers dune growth. So you put in variables of sand and wind speed and so forth, and then evolve these dunes over time. And Aeolus typically was a little bit clumsy in terms of how it dealt with vegetation. And so what we have done is try to refine the model to better represent how these different species actually capture sand and build dunes. And so in this model, you can see a picture of some dune grasses. We make many measurements of those dune grasses. We translate those measurements of height and width and so forth to a volume or a area, excuse me. You can see that there in the middle graph where we've got this kind of grass that's now occupying an area. And then we can take those areas, so those species-specific areas, and place them on a grid. And that's what all those little dots are in that middle graph. And then that grid is what the model sees in terms of sand capture. And so you can see on the very far left, there are 3 dunes. The first one that's sort of tallest is the Ammophila arenaria dune. The second one is the Ammophila breviligulata dune, and it actually creates a dune that's kind of wider and not as tall as arenaria. And then there's a little tiny dunelet at the back, and that's actually created by the native species, Lamus mollis, which is part of this model as well. So you can see that Lamus mollis is really not as good a sand capturer as the other species. And so we can kind of place all the grasses in context with each other. And that's what I have here. This is actually a drawing from the review article, the Nature Review article that just came out a few weeks ago. And what this shows is Ammophila arenaria on the right, Ammophila breviligulata, uniola, which is a grass species on the East Coast, Spartina patens, which is also a grass species in dunes on the East Coast, and then Lamus mollis on the far left. And as you change the spacing of the plants, or basically the growth form of the plant, and its height, and the width of the blades of the plant, you change how much sand can be captured by these plants. And so you can see Ammophila arenaria has lots of very dense stems that are very thin, and it also grows really well vertically. And so by growing very well vertically, it can keep up with the sand deposition, right? And actually kind of through that feedback, create these kind of taller, narrower dunes. Compared to Ammophila breviligulata, which really specializes in growing horizontally. And it can obviously grow vertically and keep up with sand, but it mostly grows horizontally. And so what it's doing is really shaping a dune that's shorter but wider. It's sort of packaging maybe the same amount of sand in a different way. And then over on the far left, You can see Lamus mollis. This grass is very, very sparse. It's taller than the other two species, but because it's sparse and because it grows horizontally, it actually captures less sand overall than the other invasive species. Okay, so once we know what, sort of how dunes are created and what controls their height, we want to know kind of the next step, which is how are beaches and dunes flooded and eroded. And this work is really, a lot of this work is Peter Ruggiero's work. I collaborate with him, but he's the specialist on this part of our project. And so what he does is take regional shoreline data and dune shape and and also combine that with sea level rise or sea level climate, wave climate scenarios, and places all those into these storm impact models. And what those do is project what coastal flooding will be now and in the future, given certain dune heights and characteristics of the beach. And you can model this kind of erosion and flooding risk, and then you can use proxies, and we have proxies here of chronic safe beach hours, collision hours, and overtopping hours. And these proxies then can be given to communities that live behind these areas to understand the risks that are posed for particular areas of the coast. And that picture, hopefully it's going, yeah, is a house being flooded. It's built on top of a dune, and it's being flooded by some large waves and a storm event. But one of the kind of interesting statistics that comes out of all these models is that what they show is the dune height, so the height of the dune, which is really determined, right, by sand supply and beach grass species, that has a fourfold greater effect on the overtopping and flooding risks of dunes than does any kind of change in sea level or even extreme waves. And I'm not talking about tsunamis because they're kind of in their own category. But so the height of the dune really matters to flood risk. Okay, so what I want to do now is talk about the future. So how do we manage coastal dunes for biodiversity, for carbon storage, and also for a new invader? And as I told you earlier, these native dune communities are these fascinating places that had, incredible diversity, that, these species that can kind of thrive under these extreme conditions, but we don't know very much about them. But we want to know more, and we want to store them as much as we can in areas where flood risk isn't an issue. And that's where dune restoration comes into play. And so dunes have been restored for many years now. We have a number of restoration areas in Oregon, and also there's one in Washington at Ledbetter Point. And these restoration areas are areas where dunes are bulldozed down to flatten the dune and also to get rid of the grasses as much as possible, and provide nesting habitat for western snowy plovers. They're listed as threatened under ESA. And so we can collect data on these HRAs to try to understand how recovery is occurring, what's happening to the plant community on these HRAs. And we've been doing that for about 20 years now. And here's one paper that looked at all the HRAs. So each one of those data points up there is an HRA. And it's really considering beach grass percent cover. So how much beach grass is present, on the HRA versus the recovery of western snowy plovers. So western snowy plover productivity, the risk of flooding, foredune erosion, native plant species richness, and then rare plant species, and in particular pink sand verbena, which is also a very rare endemic plant species on dunes. And what you can see is that when you remove beach grasses, western snowy plover productivity skyrockets. So they do much, much better without beach grasses. Although the risk of flooding increases given the fact that these foredunes are being bulldozed, erosion also goes up. Native plant species richness doesn't change much. And part of that is because it takes a long time for these plants to recover, especially after bulldozing events. But you can see with the pink sand verbena that it actually is doing quite well when beach grasses are removed and foredunes are bulldozed. So the native species are responding to that kind of restoration quite a bit, but there is a cost, which is risk of flooding and risk of erosion increases. Luckily, all these places that are being restored are not, do not have humans living behind them. They're, federal land and state land. So the risk of flooding and the risk of erosion isn't necessarily a management problem. One of the other things that we've been really interested in is, given this, landscape level transformation and just lots and lots of green vegetation out there in these dunes, what does that mean in terms of carbon storage? How much carbon is actually being stored in these dune systems? And surprisingly, people have not measured this much in any dune system around the world. There are only a handful of studies where people have actually measured the amount of carbon that's being stored in dunes. So we decided to do that, and here's a picture of some lab members coring in the dune, and basically what we're doing is taking a core a meter down into the dune, and we're also collecting vegetation, so we know how much carbon is in the above ground vegetation and how much carbon is stored in the rhizomes of the plants, but also the sand itself. And we use loss on ignition techniques to measure how much carbon is present. And then we did this work at how many places? 5, 8, 11 different sites along the coast, from Grayland Plains, which is up in Washington, all the way down to Umpqua Dunes down in Oregon. And what these values are the tons of carbon per meter along shore of the dune. So if you were to take a slice out of the dune, and these are spatially explicit areas, so we're taking information about dune volume at all of these locations and calculating how much carbon is present within those dunes. And what you can see is that there's a lot of carbon at Clatsop Plains. I mentioned Clatsop Plains earlier, but there's a lot of sand there, and because of that, there's quite a bit of carbon also at Nehalem Bay. But other places, pretty equal in terms of the amount of carbon that they contain. I think the one kind of interesting thing is that we have 2 to 3 times more carbon than is stored in the US Atlantic coast dunes. So our dunes are way more productive. The grasses are way more productive than what we see on the East Coast. Okay, and I want to just finish up with talking about a new and emerging beachgrass player in the system. This is a beachgrass that we discovered about 10 to 15 years ago. And this species, we sort of saw this unusual grass out there. One of the ways that you can tell the difference between the Ammophilas, Ammophila breviligulata and Ammophila arenaria, is to look at the ligule. And the ligule is the little tissue that is, you can see that's been, where someone has pulled down the blade and exposed that tissue. And in Ammophila arenaria, the tissue is about 1 centimeter long. In breviligulata, it's about 1 millimeter long. So right away, you can say, okay, this is breviligulata because it has a brevi, a very small little ligule, compared to arenaria, where the ligule is huge, right? Well, we were finding these plants that kind of had a ligule that was about 0.5 centimeters long. And so half the length of arenaria. Often the ligule is split. You can kind of see that there in the far left picture. And we were thinking to ourselves, this is kind of unusual, and this grass kind of looks different. And so we suspected that it might be a hybrid between the 2 non-native beach grasses. And this is work by Rebecca Mostow. She was able to sequence the 2 species and discover, or the 3 species, but especially the hybrid, and discovered that it in fact is a hybrid between the 2 Ammophilas. And so this is a pretty new discovery. Like there isn't any place on Earth where this hybrid occurs, because there isn't any place on Earth where these 2 beach grasses kind of co-occur together and have the opportunity to reproduce. So it's kind of, you know, a very cool discovery. One of the pictures there with the circle around it, that's the hybrid. One of the ways you can also tell the difference is that it tends to have a very bright purple stem compared to the parents. The one that's next to it on the left is Ammophila breviligulata. It's kind of a pinker stem. And so one of the early things that we did was try to get people to recognize the hybrid. So we created this iNaturalist site, and actually a kind of a community science project where we train people to identify the hybrid and then enter their IDs into iNaturalist or their observations. So we were able to collect a fair amount of data on how prevalent the hybrid is, because initially we found maybe 5 individuals. We didn't know, like, is this just kind of this very rare kind of event, or is it something that's like wider than that? And through iNaturalist, and also my grad students walking the beaches of Washington and Oregon, or mostly Washington, but into Oregon, we were able to identify at least 30 hybrid individuals, or sorry, 300 hybrid individuals. And we've actually found many, many more than that. I think we're probably up to about 500 individuals, and they're spread out all over the coast, from up in Ocean Shores all the way down to Fort Stevens, and then actually in Pacific City as well. That's the farthest south that we found it. But Pacific City has both of the parent species. It's one of the most southerly places that has both of the parent species, and sure enough, we found the hybrid there. So we found it pretty much everywhere that we've looked, and you know, it seems like it's a species here to stay unless we try to target its removal. So we wanted to really know, does it matter? What does the hybrid do? Is it able to capture more sand? You know, what's its morphology? How is it, what are the consequences of this hybridization? And so we've done a lot of research looking at hybrid growth and competitive ability. And we actually did this work here at Hatfield. There were a bunch of bags out there for a couple of years. People probably noticed, although a lot of this happened during the pandemic. And we grew the grasses, the 3 species in these bags, and set up competition experiments. We also looked at their growth rate without competition, so in monoculture. And what we found, I think, is actually pretty extraordinary. So the hybrid grows 2 to 3 times faster than its parent species. So you can see this is growth rate over time, so date on the bottom and stem density. And you can see that the blue is Ammophila breviligulata, the red is Ammophila arenaria, and the purple is the hybrid. And by the end of the experiment, you can see how many more stems the hybrid produced compared to its parents. So it was really, really, really productive plant. The competition experiment also showed that it can outcompete Ammophila breviligulata very, very easily. And Ammophila arenaria depends a little bit on the starting densities of the experiment. So it's what we call unstable competition. But sometimes the hybrid wins in competition, sometimes arenaria will win in competition. But through these experiments in the bags, we were able to kind of reconstruct their growth form and their morphology. And so that's kind of drawn here. This is the European beachgrass on the top, and you can see that through time, it tends to grow vertically. It's very dense, and it builds tall and narrow dunes. Ammophila breviligulata tends to grow horizontally, less densely, and it forms shorter and wider dunes. And the hybrid does both. It's able to send out lateral rhizomes and spread out laterally, but then also it's able to grow vertically fast as well. So by having this kind of vertical and horizontal characteristic to its growth, we would predict that it could, potentially create taller and wider dunes. Does it do that? So we did an experiment. This was set up in 2021 at Nehalem. This is this 4-dune scale experiment that I talked about earlier. I'm sorry? Yes, yeah. And so this is a plover restoration area that we were able to use a little part of this plover restoration area to, so it was, the dune was bulldozed flat. And then we planted various treatments of beach grasses, either Ammophila arenaria, Ammophila breviligulata, both of them in polyculture, all the grasses, the native grass, native plants, etc. So we had 8 treatments, I think, and controls as well. And here are the results of the experiment after 5 years. So at the very top, you can see that was the control. So over time, all those lines, those squiggly curves represent sand accretion over time, or the elevation of the dune over time. And you can see that the elevation didn't really change in the control. The next one is the Ammophila arenaria, so that's at the very top in the middle. It has the tallest dune. It captures the most amount of sand compared to the polyculture. Ammophila breviligulata is D there. You can see it's creating a shorter and wider dune, just like we would predict. And the hybrid is F. So the hybrid is building a dune that's somewhere intermediate between arenaria and breviligulata. Interestingly, G is Elamis mollis, so it's the native grass, does not build a dune, does not build very tall dunes over this, period of time. And then I is actually the natives, and that includes this Festuca ammobia, which is also a native grass that tends to grow a little bit like Ammophila arenaria. And so it is actually kind of a native equivalent, if you will, of Ammophila arenaria. And then I'm just going to finish up here. The hybrid, what's its potential to spread and dominate? Well, we think its potential is pretty high. It might happen over 50 years, but we know that these beach grasses can grow fast. They can outcompete each other very quickly. We know from the experiment of Ammophila breviligulata that it spread very quickly and outcompeted Ammophila arenaria. So there's no reason why the hybrid can't do the same. And so what would that do? Maybe it would result in taller dunes, especially if the dunes are dominated by Ammophila breviligulata, that shorter dune building plant species. Changes are coming with this new hybrid, and it's worth paying attention to. What are our next steps? Well, we want to find more hybrid beach grass, and we want to study its population genetics and its ecology to be able to predict how fast it's spreading. Because one of the things that hybrids do is they can form these things called hybrid swarms, where they start reproducing with the parents, so they back cross with the parents. They can also reproduce with themselves and form F2 hybrids. And all of that reproducing means that the hybrid's genes are being, and the parent species genes are all being muddled up and mixed up. And so that can, create a faster invasion than you would normally have without that kind of swarm characteristic. And I will say that the hybrid can breed with itself. So we have found F2 hybrids. And we've also found a back cross where the hybrid reproduced with Ammophila arenaria. So we found one case of that, and I'm guessing there'll probably be more cases. We also want to study native plant communities, both in invaded dunes. We want to understand what's happening with these native plants in invaded dunes. We haven't really paid attention much to them, but also helping to develop better techniques to restore native plants in restoration areas. And then obviously continue to seek coastal planning solutions so that we can optimize coastal protection with the other services that we really care about, like the native biodiversity and carbon storage, and et cetera. Okay, questions, thoughts? Appreciate your attention. Yeah.
Hang on. All right, so just a quick reminder that I see lots of hands going up. This is a hybrid event, just like hybrid grasses. And so we're going to bounce back and forth between questions online and questions in the room. And if you have a question that's in the room, you do need a mic so that folks online can hear. We're going to start with Roseanne, who has a question online.
Thank you for the wonderful and easy to follow review. Any idea on how carbon accumulation is greater in dunes of this coast relative to the East Coast? And is there a correlation with plant density? And is there less migration of the sand on this coast after it accumulates?
Yeah, I would say yes to all that. So we have more sand. So more sand can store more carbon. The carbon particles are very tiny in the sand, but there's also more roots and rhizomes If you have a larger dune, you're going to have more of that. So we have that going for us. We have incredible marine productivity that's making its way to these dunes and fertilizing them. We also have, we don't have hurricanes and we don't have these events that erode the dunes and wash away the carbon that's contained in the dunes on the East Coast. So I think all those factors are at play in the, you know, sort of the comparison between the East and the West Coast. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Questions in the room?
When she talked that close, then I couldn't understand her. Can people hear me?
Yep.
So I'm Rennie Ferris. I've probably planted more beach grass or been part of it or supplied it than, except for Wilbur Turnick.
Oh,
And you were talking about mollusks, and there are a couple of dunes on the South Jetty Road in Florence that are totally dominated by mollusks, and and areas that are totally dominated by mollusks. And I don't know if that's from persistence of what was there before or what, but we've been trying like heck to get mollusks going on Manzanita,
Mhm.
Halem Spit, and been very unsuccessful.
yeah.
Yeah, my understanding is that European beach grass, and I don't really have any idea about the mollusks, but European in particular does not propagate much from seed. It's almost all vegetative. Is that not correct?
No, I think that's correct. Yeah.
Oh, might be why there's not the rapid spread of the hybrid, is that most of the seeds don't survive. It's the vegetation,
Right.
the runners, the pieces that get dislodged and drifted, or the people that get pulled, those that get pulled up by crews and
Mhm.
planted.
Mhm.
And so far, the breviligulata has been any sites that might be collectible or donor sites have been off limit, so it's
Mhm.
hard to
Yeah.
plant.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, it's interesting to try to understand how it disperses, how the beach grasses disperse.
One more little thing. Is it your notion, you have any idea if the vast majority of the European isn't all the exact same genetics because so much of the spread has been vegetative?
Uh, the genetics of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, really good question. I mean, it's actually fairly diverse, yeah, genetically. So it's not just one genotype. Yeah. Which is interesting. And, you know, no one's sort of paid attention to all the planting where it's happened, you know, just all over time, and how plants were, you know, incorporated into that planting scheme. So I would have guessed that genetic diversity would be low, but it's not. Yeah.
All right. We got a question online.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Roseanne.
What are the sources of dune sand? Are there areas adjacent beaches or nearshore benthos that are measurably losing sand to the dunes?
Yeah. So the sources come from the ocean, right? And currents and the shoreline. So, you know, the wider the beach you have, the more sand potential to be deposited on the dune from wind. Some people think that a lot of that sand is being basically captured and stored in dunes, and that it's you know, decreasing the amount of sand that might be available to the shoreline or to the beach. And whether or not that's happening, nobody really knows. Yeah.
Hang on, sir. We got to take turns. Hang on. Got a question up here.
Mhm.
Sally, thanks for the talk. It's super interesting. I have a question about, you talked about managing for ecosystem services function, that kind of thing, and maybe, having native plant restoration areas in some places where we're less concerned about the protective functions. And my question is, to what extent would those areas that say maybe are prioritized for restoration of natives would need a lot of maintenance, or could they be self-sustaining in an environment that has this mixture or mosaic of
Yeah.
two kind of objectives, if you will, for management? I'm curious.
I think it's a good question. I think there's a lot of maintenance needed early on. And because the grasses they are able to grow back. They're very resilient. And so a lot of maintenance early on that might involve, bulldozing initially, and then going back and using herbicides to try to control the grasses while favoring the non-native, the native species, plants. Also planting, actually physically going out there and planting natives. It's very, very early days in terms of doing that work. But there are cases, there are examples from Northern California where they've restored dunes back to their old glory, and they've been able to, through, just maintenance and effort, create what, probably was the native dune community. There's also the issue of, how much flooding and erosion do you want to allow? Because in many ways that keeps the grasses from establishing as well. So once you kind of bulldoze down the dune so that it's short enough, you could have this kind of, flooding effect that doesn't, necessarily affect the natives, but will have detrimental effects on the non-natives.
I have one unrelated but question to, sorry. How, do you, in your understanding of the hybrid, the initial hybridization and the distribution, is it one sort of like hybrid event that then dispersed, or do you think there are multiple incidents of hybridization?
Multiple genotypes, and we haven't found any individuals that we would say, here's an individual, oh, and it has the same genotype as this other individual. Not that we won't find that, but we haven't found that yet. So each one of them, I think, is unique. The other thing is we don't know when the hybridization started. I mean, we know it started after 1935 because that's when breviligulata was planted, but so we don't know, obviously F1s were the first ones that were created, but we don't know like the distribution of F1s to F2s, like how many F2s are out there now. So, lots of really, really, really cool population genetics stuff that we don't know about, but that we're working on. Yeah.
There's considerable sand migration from inshore to offshore, summer to winter. And I think there's 27 sites on the Oregon coast of old forests that have sunk, and those stumps totally disappear in the summertime with the accretion of the sand. That's the right word.
Yeah.
The sand building up. You can really see it at Neoconi, with the stumps there are so tall that you can tell just how much sand moves in there. And short cells, where there's sand between two headlands, stays the same, stay more contained, and you get a lot more movement in places like Pacific City, where you've got such a long beach that sand's blowing off the open sand, and if it blows 25 miles an hour, it doesn't matter how hard it's raining, that sand is going to move.
Yeah.
And any little disturbance at all, a straw or a beachgrass plant, you'll see the sand immediately start piling up
Yeah, around it.
behind that.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, we're really close to time, but I'll take one last question here and we'll wrap it up.
Thanks for a great presentation,
Thank you.
and really interesting stuff. It seems fairly obvious from your title even that you consider both of the species of grasses that were introduced to be invasive.
Mhm.
And I am currently working on the Oregon State Wildlife Action Plan.
Mhm.
And I don't believe that those species, I looked at the ODA list
Right.
and, you know, what they call noxious weeds. They
Right.
don't really have a list of specifically non-native and invasive
Mhm.
types vegetation
Mhm.
per se.
Mhm.
And yet, you know, so I guess my question again, because state wildlife action plans are focused on fauna rather than on, you know, flora.
Mhm.
My question relates to the, you know, species that were native to the dune areas. And if you think that it's had a huge effect, or are there a lot of papers on the effects of the of that change
Right.
to those species? I mean,
Yeah.
obviously the snowy plover, we've got some pretty good data on,
Right.
but many
Exactly.
other species we probably don't, or
Exactly.
maybe we do and I'm just not aware of it.
Yeah, we don't have very good data. Nobody really studied the system as it was changing. So we have what we have now, and there are many native species in the, you know, invaded dunes, right? Lots and lots of natives, but, you know, many of the endemic ones that were part of kind of the native community aren't there anymore. It's interesting that you say that. I think in Washington, Ammophila is now considered a noxious plant. So, you know, it just depends on what state you're in.
All right,
We like our noxious plants here in Oregon.
let's give one more round of applause for
Great,
Sally Hacker,
thanks.
please. Thank you so much, Sally. Everybody in the room, I hope to see you at when we start our summer seminar series up at the end of the month, and hopefully you'll come to Markham on the 18th. Thanks, everyone.
Hattie.
Interesting to see what happens with native species. I think there's ones that are very adept at moving in on even relatively active dunes.
Mhm.
And then if you get behind that dynamic foredune in behind it, then there's a lot more species that
Yeah.
start showing up.
Right.
And Nehalem, do you know where Nestucca Ridge's office is?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you go up the hill from there, there's a spot, you gotta trespass to get past it, but there's a BLM. Well, I don't think people up there. I'm not sure about it because I'm sensitive to it, but there's a strip that must be 100 yards long and or wide and a mile long that for some reason has stayed bare and free of grass, or it was.
Mhm.
And the population in there was so different.
Huh, cool.
All kinds of little things,
Mhm.
little delicate things.
Nice.
And looking at them to walk through there was really something.
Nice.
And
Huh.
in the more stable one, you start to see, what is it, macrophylla.